We always enjoy during Vacation Bible School the special teachers that we have in the auditorium. This year we are just delighted to have Nathan Ward speaking with us. If you've sat in any of Nathan's classes in his studies of the Old Testament, you know that you're going to learn an awful lot over the next 4 sessions. You're going to be introduced to things in the text that you'll look at and say, how in the world did I miss that? I had the opportunity to be with Nathan last fall. We were at a gathering. There were 32 preachers there, and Nathan did teaching out of the book of Genesis. It was just absolutely outstanding. So we're looking forward to this study in the Exodus. We're going to give him all the time we can. Nathan, come on in. Well, he's going to get you mic'd up real quick there.
I'd rather, Don said, we worked really hard at finding someone good, but we couldn't for some reason, and this guy's local, so we dragged him down here to keep those expectations nice and low. That's my preference. I figure if expectations are low, it's easier to meet them. Here we are, I guess. Far be it from me to disagree with Don Truex. But as I was listening to him speak to the children, and I was thinking about the Israelites, especially this Exodus generation that he led through the wilderness, it's hard for me to say and to agree with him that Moses did not herd donkeys. Those were some of the most stubborn, obstinate, awful people that you find anywhere in the Bible, and so that's my one critique that I'll give of that. Well, we are looking at Moses and the Exodus, and there is a lot of text to try to cover in these 4 sessions, and obviously we're not going to be able to speak in detail about every single thing that is there. I've had to be selective as I've worked my way through this and studying it and putting this material together. And so there'll be a lot of questions that go unanswered because that's just the nature of the beast when we're trying to cover this much. I'll probably also not open the floor for discussion as much as I might prefer to, because, again, there's so much to cover, but I'll try from time to time to see if there are questions or points of follow-up or something that we've missed that is worth giving some thought to. Yep. So if you want to turn to Exodus chapter... From Exodus chapter 3 and 4, and give some thought to the call of Moses. As we get into the call of Moses, I'll say just a little bit about how they get to this position. Of course, you're familiar with how this goes. They go down with Joseph, Jacob and his sons and family during the famine after Joseph is elevated to this position in Egypt that is something like prime minister or something like that. And they begin to grow into a people there in the region of Goshen in Egypt. And it says in chapter 1, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And that probably doesn't mean that he'd never heard of the name of Joseph or was completely unaware of the history of Joseph. It means that there was no relationship there and he couldn't care less about who this Joseph was. And as you look at chapter 1, it becomes pretty obvious that the general tone of this chapter is enslavement and exploitation and murder. It's a pretty rough way to start this book of Exodus. But the book of Exodus becomes one of the most important books in the Old Testament, or at least the Exodus itself becomes one of the most important events in the Old Testament. When we think of the Exodus, we need to think of it not as just some really cool thing that happened a long time ago for these people. It's more than just that. Remember, the Egyptian sojourn and return was foretold as early as Genesis chapter 15 to Abraham, when he's told his descendants he won't inherit this land. His descendants will. They'll be somewhere else for 400 years and then come back. They'll be oppressed and then they'll come back. And the book of Genesis concludes with Joseph's final words, "When you come back, bring my bones with you." What God is doing here in the Exodus is not just really cool miracles. He's delivering his people from slavery and taking them to the promised land as he overthrows the world's most powerful nation in fulfillment of his covenant promises. The Exodus isn't just about deliverance from slavery. The Exodus is about the fulfillment of God's covenant promises. You remember Genesis chapter 12, right? There are three parts of the promise to Abraham: the seed, the nation, and the land. We usually say that in reverse order. But the land is a big part of this, and that's what he's doing. He's not just taking them out of Egypt, he's taking them to the land that he has promised them. And so the Exodus is so significant because it is the fulfillment of God's promises, it's the fulfillment of God's purpose. This is the moment that the nation of Israel really is formed as a nation. Before, they were a family. It was Jacob and his sons, and they were growing as a family. When they come out of Egypt, they are given their law code. They are brought to their land that they are going to occupy. They are given leaders over their people. And we find when we get later in the book with the Passover itself that they're given a new calendar as well. The calendar is reset and starts there with the Exodus, with the deliverance, with the Passover as well. It's no wonder that in the Old Testament there is no event that is as significant as the Exodus. It is constantly referred to through the rest of Scripture. Anytime any Old Testament writer or prophet or leader wanted to emphasize that God is their God, and they know that God is their God, it is by pointing to the Exodus event. It's all over the Psalms. It's all over the prophets. It's all over prayers in the Bible. The Exodus is as important as it gets. But it starts so negatively. Again, exploitation, enslavement, murder is where it begins. And in fact, in chapter 2, when we're first introduced to Moses, in verse 1, now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and there we go, and Moses is born. And we don't even know who his parents are. Their names are completely skipped at this point in the story, so we can be told about their tribal affiliation. Now, from our side of all of this, we hear Levite and we think, ooh, that's good. That's not where they were at this point in history. The last two things you know about Levi at this point in history is, one, he and his brother Simeon mass murdered an entire town, and two, because of that, their anger is cursed by Jacob and the blessings in Genesis chapter 49, and they are removed basically from any sort of inheritance the family is going to receive. At this point in history, being Levite's not a good thing. That changes when the Levites rally behind Moses. But at this point, being a Levite is a negative. There's nothing special about them except they're exceptionally cursed. And so there is bad things happening in chapter 1. There's this ominous guy that suddenly shows up, and he becomes the target of Pharaoh's murderous intent. And of course, God intervenes and saves him. And that is, in the larger biblical picture, one more example of difficult birth stories. You're familiar with those in the Bible, of course. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Hannah, mother of Samson, Mary. I mean, all sorts of birth stories. It's just like, how on earth did this baby get to be born? Usually it's barrenness, but this is a very different kind. He's got a gigantic target on his back from the most powerful man in the world to get him killed. You know, it seems that God is intent on making it clear to everyone who is watching that the reason his plans work out is because he is the one who is in control and guiding things. It has nothing to do with human achievement. It has nothing to do with human purposes or human strength or human anything. And this is one of those constant hints that that is the case. God is in control. God is working out his purposes. And it's amazing how frequently his plan features these great figures and deliverers who come only by his grace. Well, Moses is rescued by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in Pharaoh's house. He's nursed by his own mother, and you can read about that in Exodus chapter 2. And so he gets at least some teaching about his real identity. We don't have details of that. We can speculate what it might have been, but whatever the case may be, eventually he decides that he needs to be with his people, not with the Egyptians. And that's not something you get a lot of detail in the book of Exodus. The author of Hebrews tells us about that faith that it takes for him to make that identification with his people in Hebrews 11:24 through 26. And Stephen tells us in his sermon in Acts chapter 7 that when he killed the Egyptian, because the Egyptian was beating one of the Hebrews, that he did so to deliver his people, but they did not accept him. They did not understand. He thought they would understand that this is what he was doing. They did not understand. So the next day when he saw a couple of Hebrews arguing with one another, and he tried to intervene again, and one of them said, "What, are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" He thought to himself, uh-oh, I got to get out of here. This is not a safe place for me to be. And he flees to Midian, and he'll stay there for the next 40 years. He gets there and he saves the daughters of the priest of Midian. One of them becomes his wife. He shepherds the flocks. Pharaoh dies. God hears the groaning of the people, and God begins to act. And with all of that is something of background, at least a pretty quick survey of background, we get to Exodus chapter 3. In verse 1, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. There's all kinds of details that we can focus on, and most of them we just can't do justice to. Horeb here is another name for Mount Sinai, and we don't know exactly where that is, geographically speaking. There's kind of a traditional location that everyone thinks of as the best bet for Mount Sinai, but there's no certainty about that. It does seem to be a really special place. Moses meets God here now. He meets God again at Mount Sinai at the giving of the Ten Commandments. Elijah flees to Mount Sinai in 1 Kings chapter 16. And as significant as it is, it's kind of remarkable that we're not 100% certain what mountain Mount Sinai is. You would think that as big of a deal as this mountain is, there would be a 100% certainty by everybody through all the generations, and yet that's not the case, which maybe is a nice reminder that little physical things like that, however significant they might be, shouldn't be that important to us the way we sometimes make them. But whatever the case may be, what's more significant about Horeb here is that this is one of the many major events of the Old Testament that is outside the Promised Land. And that's the sort of thing that we may shrug our shoulders at or think, oh yeah, maybe I never thought of that exactly, but it's kind of obvious once you give a little thought to it. I mean, obviously the call of Abraham is outside the land. The call of Moses, the giving of the law, is outside the land. Some of the really important prophecies like Ezekiel and Daniel are from outside the land. The reversal of Saul's failure to destroy the Amalekites that you find in the book of Esther is outside. All of this stuff that's outside the land, so what? Well, again, maybe this is something God is trying to show them throughout their history. In the ancient world, people thought of their gods as geographically restricted. My God is powerful here in my land, and once I leave my land, my God may not be quite so powerful. That's how the pagans thought about their gods. My God has authority here, but he doesn't necessarily have authority over there. Well, God is showing from the beginning a couple of things. One is that he is not restricted to a geographic region like the pagan deities supposedly were. Secondly, that things outside the promised land are important to God. That's a pretty big biblical theme as well. You get to the prophets and all these messages about the Gentiles. come down in terms of what God is going to do. And of course, in the New Testament, that becomes obvious where all of that is pointing. But maybe even beyond that, what God says about this ground, and you think about how so many Jewish people and Israelite people before would have talked about pagan ground, land that is outside the Holy Land. What is it? Well, one thing it is unclean, right? It is unclean to be on this pagan dirt. That's how they would have thought about this. But what does God say about this ground that Moses is at? It's holy ground. Well, what is it that makes something holy ground? Well, it's not what geographic region it's in. It's whether God is present. Any ground is holy ground if God is present. And that's one of the things that this shows us, and we could think about that, in a variety of different sorts of ways and try to draw practical applications out of that. And I'll leave that for you to meditate on as far as that goes. The next question as we look at this is, what on earth is going on with a burning bush? Have you ever asked that question before? Of all the ways that God could have appeared, a burning bush that doesn't ever go out and doesn't burn up, and all sorts of things that go along with that. What is going on with this? Well, I think there are two parts of this. There's the bush and the burning. That's why it's called the burning bush. Very complicated things we deal with in biblical studies. I hope you can keep up. The burning bush was both burning and a bush. Is everyone still with me? Well, I think each of those there is significance to. One is the bush itself. One of the things we don't think a lot about, at least I've not thought a lot about it until I was doing my study on this, is that how closely trees are related to God, and probably in a symbolic kind of sense, but it's very frequent. There is the tree of life, for example, in the Garden of Eden. And eating from the tree of life gives eternal life, which is, in essence, eternal presence with God. And in Revelation 22, in the New Jerusalem, the tree of life is back. And so, again, eternal presence with God through partaking of this tree. You might think of the Exodus story itself when you get to the book of Numbers, and there are people saying, well, what's the big deal about Aaron? And why is he so special? Why can't we be priests like he is? And God says, I'll give you a sign and show you who my priest is. And that's the story where Aaron's rod buds. What is it? It's a staff of wood that comes to life. And it's a little tree in his hand is what it is. You might think of the menorah, the candle in the tabernacle and later in the temple. The menorah is not just a funny-shaped candle. It's a tree-shaped candle. And if you read the instructions about it in Exodus chapter 32, it is specifically described in tree terms. And this is what provides the light in the holy place. And so you have this constant association of God and trees. For God to show up in a bush, there is something sensible about that. Now, to the question, why is there this association of God and trees? I don't know. I just know that it's there. Why does God see fit to use this? And I don't know. Someone smarter than me might have the answer to that. But whatever the case is, this one is on fire, and it's not being consumed. And so there is this kind of eternal life almost present in this bush that is not dying in spite of the fact that you expect it to die in this. But beyond that, fire is constantly associated with God's presence. There's the fire pot of the flaming torch in Genesis chapter 15 in that covenant-making ceremony that God has with Abraham. There's the pillar of fire that leads the people through the wilderness in Exodus chapter 13. When they get to Mount Sinai and he descends on the mountain to show his presence, there on the mountaintop there is the fire as well in Exodus chapter 19. And in constant passages about judgment, God's presence shows up as a fire. You might remember the verse in Hebrews, our God is a consuming fire. This image of God and fire constantly shows one of two things, either purification or presence. It either indicates that God is there or that God is there and he is purifying. And the purification has two sides. Sometimes the fire purifies, sometimes the fire destroys. Think of 1 Peter chapter 1 where it talks about our faith being like gold purified by fire. Well, you throw the gold into the fire and the impurities are burned away. You throw something other than gold into the fire and it completely is destroyed, right? And so the purifying fire is also a destroying fire, depending on what is there. And so that seems to be part of the idea here, is this is God's presence. And that's the idea. And, whether Moses immediately understood that or not, I mean, not immediately, he's like, well, what's going on over there? And he walked over there, and God begins to speak to him. Moses, Moses, doubling is for emphasis. They didn't have, bold, italic, underline, all caps to use. And so things were emphasized with repetition. Abraham, Abraham, Samuel, Samuel, Absalom, Absalom, my father, my God, and on down the line it goes. And the conversation happens, and there are a few other details we could talk about, and maybe if we have time we can look back to some of those. But I want to jump a little bit forward to God's statement in verse 6. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is the God of their ancestors. He is the God of the covenant. And that is important because when Moses comes to his people with this message, he's not bringing to them a new God. He's bringing to them the God they already know. But he's bringing to them the God they already know in a way they've never heard of him before. He is bringing to them the God they know in a fuller revelation, a new picture, a new aspect of the relationship, ultimately a new covenant. It's kind of funny to call the old covenant a new covenant, but from Moses' perspective, that's what it is. It's a new covenant is what it is. And when you stop and you think about people who know God and this great leader who is bringing a new revelation of this God, a new relationship with this God, a new covenant with this God, who do you immediately think of? Well, Moses isn't the first name that we would come to mind with that. There's a sense in which Moses and Jesus are very parallel figures with one another. When we hear someone showing us a fuller revelation of God, bringing us a new relationship and a new covenant, that's Jesus. And one of the mistakes that we make sometimes is in response to, a history of Jewish theology that has so overemphasized Moses, we swing the pendulum too far and say, Moses, there's nothing special about that guy. He's just another dude. Well, Moses wasn't just another guy. And it's not just because he foreshadows Jesus in so many ways. A lot of people in the Old Testament foreshadow Jesus. It's because when Miriam and Aaron said, what's so special about Moses? God himself said, I'll tell you what's so special about Moses. I speak to people in a variety of ways, and I speak to no one the way that I speak to Moses. There is something unique about this leader, and so much of that uniqueness points us forward to Jesus, who is an even greater example of a leader without parallel. Well, God continues in verse 7 and says, I've surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of a land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I've also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And this is a remarkable thing that happens here. Actually, before that, let me just emphasize in verse 8. I've come to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the land of the Canaanites. I mean, how many times does he have to say land here in this sentence? You get the idea that this is all about going to the land. And so again, this is one of those places where it's emphasized that this is the fulfillment of the promise. That's what's going on here. But what's really amazing about this, verse 7, God says, I have seen what's going on. Verse 8, he says, I have come down to deliver them. Verse 9, the cry of the people has come to me, and I have seen the oppression that is going to happen. And you can imagine what's going through Moses' mind right now, right? This is incredible. God himself is speaking to me. God is about to deliver us from this horror that we've been going through for decades now. And he's come to speak to me, and I'm going to have a front row seat for God's great deliverance. And what Moses doesn't know is just how front row his seat is going to be. Because there is nothing in verses 7 through 9 that prepares him for verse 10. I have seen, I have heard, I have come down, I am going to deliver. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring out my people. What? I thought you said you were going to deliver them. You can understand why Moses is a little, unsure when God begins to speak to him. God has seen, God has heard, God knows, God has come down to deliver, God is going to take them to the land of promise. Now, Moses, get up and get moving so you can do this. What? This doesn't make any sense at all. It's time to make your return to Egypt. Former royalty, current fugitive. Go up to Pharaoh and emancipate my people. It's no wonder he's a little hesitant here. And so we get then to these objections of Moses, and this is what I want to spend the rest of our time thinking about. I guess before that, let me stop for a second and ask if there's any questions or brief comments that anyone would like to add to our discussion up to this point. Yes. Yeah, if you didn't hear that, what she said was that, you see these experiences of people speaking directly to God like this, and on the one hand, you tend to get jealous that you don't get to have that experience, and on the other hand, when you stop and give thought to it, you realize just how terrifying this must have been. Let me just make two quick comments on that. I think that's absolutely right. First, we need to remember that throughout the Bible, 100% of the time, an encounter with God, and no one sees God in the fullness of his glory. But whatever way that God sees fit to manifest himself to people, an encounter with God is not just the neatest thing. It is abjectly terrifying. When Daniel has his visions, it takes weeks for him to recover sometimes. And so when we get jealous and say, ooh, I'd like that, I don't know that we know what we're asking for. And the second thing that I'd say is sometimes we get this notion in our minds that if we just could have these experiences, then our faith would be stronger. That's such an easy thing to think. I know I've thought that before. I presume most people here have thought that or something like that before. But the reality is, when you look at the Exodus generation as a great case study, I mean, they watched all the plagues. They walked through the dry land of the sea. They drank water that came out of a rock. Let me repeat that. They drank water that came out of a rock. One of those Bible stories we've heard so many times, we kind of take it for granted. They drank water that came out of a rock. They ate, magic God bread that falls from sky every morning that is provided for them. They see the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire. They saw the pyrotechnics at Mount Sinai. And on and on and on it goes. And how many of them made it to the promised land? 2, not counting Moses. I mean, how many people witnessed Jesus? The Jewish leaders. Oh no, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Let's re-kill him to get rid of the evidence. I mean, seeing is not believing. And the question is, are you tender-hearted or hard-hearted? Because witnessing God when you're hard-hearted just entrenches you in your hard-heartedness. That's the bottom line. All right. Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah, there's definitely a difference between Moses and Jesus, and I don't mean to minimize that in what I was saying. Moses is a unique individual in the history of the world. He's definitely no Jesus, though. All right, let's talk about these excuses that Moses makes, and we'll try to draw some practical things out of this as well. Verse 11, Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" But he said, "I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." When I hear Moses say, "Who am I that I should do this?" it makes me think of two different things that his statement is not. First, his statement is not what he thought a long time, some 40 years ago. This is what Stephen says. I mentioned this earlier in passing, but this is what Stephen says in Acts 7 and verse 25. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. How do you go from he supposed they would understand that God was going to give them salvation out of his hands to God saying, "I'm going to give them salvation from your hands," and him saying, "Who am I?" He has gone a very long way from where he was at the beginning of this. It actually is, what it sounds like is it sounds like what that Hebrew said to him after he killed the Egyptian in chapter 2 and verse 14, where he says, "Who made you a prince and judge over us?" Isn't that exactly what Moses is saying? Who am I that I should deliver them? It sounds like that question that he was asked is really stuck with him over the years. What they're saying is, "Who are you that you're going to deliver us?" And what he says is, "Who am I that I should deliver them?" Maybe what he's saying is something like, "I've already tried that and it didn't work. How is it going to work this time when it didn't work last time?" Or maybe it's just humility. Maybe over the years he's learned to be more humble than he was back then. We're told in the book of Numbers that he was the meekest man on the earth, and maybe he just doesn't trust his own abilities. And that kind of humility can be either good or bad, depending on what we do with it. If we are humble and we don't trust our own abilities, and that turns us to trust God instead, then that's great. If we are so humble that we don't trust our own abilities and it leads to spiritual paralysis because we don't know where to turn, or an inability or an unwillingness to ever undertake any course of action, that's a bad thing. It just depends on where we turn with that. And so this "who am I" sounds like them saying, "Who are you?" And it's a long way away from him thinking that he was going to deliver them 40 years ago. Also, what it doesn't sound a whole lot like is Isaiah. When in Isaiah's vision, God says, "Who is going to do this job that I have?" And Isaiah steps forward and says, "Here am I. Send me." Moses says, "Who am I? Send someone else." And it's very different as far as that goes. And God's answer is, "I'll be with you." This is a very common promise of God. Some 14 times it shows up to the patriarchs in different ways. "I will be with you." And it's not just an empty statement, of course. It's the covenant. What is the covenant that God makes with his people? Well, we could talk about Leviticus and Deuteronomy. We could talk about Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments. The covenant, in a nutshell, is this: "I will be your God, and you will be my people, and I will dwell with you." And everything else is a working out of what that means. What does it mean that he's their God, and they're his people, and he dwells with them? Well, read the laws, and that tells you the specifics of what that means. The rules you follow because God dwells with you. The rules you follow because he is your God, and you are his people. And so that is really the essence of the covenant. And when he says, "I will be with you," this is really just a shorthand of that. I'm your God, you're my people, I am with you. Just trust me. And when you're back here, you'll know that I have been with you, is what he goes on to say. And so Moses then says, well, if they ask what is his name, what do I say in response to that? And that is, to us, I think that's a weird objection. Maybe it seems like he's grasping at straws, trying to find a way out or something along those lines. But one thing we don't think of a whole lot is that when you go through the book of Genesis, so many times that there is a new revelation of God or a new relationship with God in some sense. It comes with a new name. And sometimes it's a new name that God gives. Sometimes it's a place that is given a new name in light of what God has done. And so the very first time in the Bible that God is called God Most High, it shows up when Abraham is with Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14. Hagar calls him El Roi, a God who sees, or who sees me, and names the place Be'er Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. God introduces himself to Abraham as El Shaddai, God Almighty, when he gives the circumcision sign and he announces the birth of Isaac in Genesis 17. Abraham renames the mountain Yahweh Yireh, Yahweh sees, in Genesis 22. After the sacrifice of Isaac, Jacob renames Luz Bethel in Genesis 28. God won't give his name to Jacob in Genesis 32 while they wrestle, but Jacob names the place of their struggle Peniel, the face of God. How many times does a new appearance of God come with a new name? It's constant. And so if Moses knows that history, that a new encounter with God brings a new revelation of his identity in some way, it makes a whole lot of sense. If the people know that this is how God acts, why would they say, well, what's the name of the God? Well, maybe this is why they would ask that question. And so God gives him this answer, I am who I am, or I shall be who I shall be, depending on what your translation does with that. And names are not just designations in the ancient Near East. They spoke of the character of the person, the nature of the person. And to use this first-person form of the verb to be in this way speaks of God as the being one, the existing one whose existence is not contingent on anything else, but it is necessary. He must exist. He always exists. But it's not just existence in general, but existence in presence. You know, who cares if there's a God that exists on some other corner of the galaxy that doesn't care about us at all? Maybe that's something we need to know about on some philosophical level, but it's only a personal God that really matters. And so his being in relationship is really what this gets to. And we don't have time to get into a lot of this, but I'll say the name Yahweh, as it is contemporarily spoken, is a guess to how God's name is pronounced. We have the 4 consonants. The vowels were not part of Hebrew originally. The vowels were added later based on the tradition of speaking the words of Scripture. But God's name was not spoken for centuries. They did not want to take his name in vain, so they stopped saying it, which I think is kind of foolish. And it's the height of irony, especially when you look at verse 15. And the end of that verse, this is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all the generations. Remember my name. We'll stop saying it. So there's a bit of an ironic, unfortunate thing going on there. But we have the consonants, and we can be pretty close to 100% certain on the first half of how that would be pronounced, and that's the Yah part. And we're confident on that because there are a whole bunch of Yah-based names that either begin with Yah or end with Yah all throughout the Bible. And those are names based on this God. And they're all Yah names, so that gives you a pretty good hint. Also, that first half of his name is the abbreviation of it that is appended to the verb praise, hallelujah, Yah. And so again, the presence of Yah all over the place tells us, pretty sure that's what the first half is. And there are reasons why scholars have concluded the last half of that as well. But whatever the case may be, he gives his name to speak of his presence and his being, and this is the name he'll bring back. Moses says in chapter 4, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice. The problem with this statement that Moses makes is if you go back to a part of the text, we're not taking the time to read all of this, but verse 18, God says, and they will listen to your voice. And Moses says, but they will not believe my voice. Well, no, God already said they would. So this is just a case of Moses not listening or Moses refusing to believe in this case. But what's remarkable about it is that you don't find this rebuke. You expect God to say, oh, ye of little faith, or something like that. And that's not what he does. He gives him these signs, the serpent and the water and all of those things that go with that, and the leprous skin. And if we had more time, we could maybe speculate as to what those mean specifically, but they are signs to prove that God is with him. God is patiently enduring with Moses. I think that's an important point of this as well. And so Moses says, well, that excuse didn't work, but I'm not eloquent. I don't speak well. And again, either Moses is grasping at straws or he legitimately has some speech defect. Or what's interesting is the phrase that is used here is used in Ezekiel chapter 3 and verse 5 when talking about speaking a non-native language and how difficult it is to speak that language. You give some thought to that. Moses grew up learning Egyptian and Hebrew, but he didn't grow up in a Hebrew household. I don't know if you ever wondered how good Moses' Hebrew was, but it might not have been perfect, and he spent the last 40 years not speaking it over in Midian. So it may well be that he feels rusty, and what he's saying is, I can't communicate to my own people very well. So there may be some legitimacy to what he's saying, but God's response is, well, pretty sure I can handle that, right? You think of the apostles at Pentecost, right? None of them could speak the languages, and yet they did. And so who made the mouth? Who formed the tongue? You think I can't deal with this problem? I'm pretty sure I can handle it. Well, send someone else. And this is the first time that God gets angry in verses 13 through 17 of chapter 4. Please send someone else. And the anger of the Lord, verse 14, was kindled against Moses. And he said, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you. And so Aaron is on his way. We don't know if that's just random providence, or maybe Aaron is coming to inform Moses that the Pharaoh has died and it's safe to come back home. Whatever the case may be, this time, God has met every one of Moses' objections head on. Moses is out of excuses, and so this time all he says is, I don't want to do it. Send someone else means I don't want to do it. And this is the time God has gotten angry. God has been patient with Moses, and honestly, even here, there is mercy. He is angry, but his solution is, I'll send someone else, and he can help you. But at what cost? Aaron suddenly comes to the forefront of the nation, which puts him in a perfect spot to build the golden calf. If Moses had just led, like God said, you wonder what might have happened at Sinai instead. I don't know what the answer to that is. But certainly, getting him in this position does not necessarily only have good effects. Well, let me just say a couple of things as we think about this, and these excuses in particular that we can draw something practical out of. First of all, is we think of Moses saying, if we want to summarize all of this, I'm not fit for the task. Who am I to do this? My speech isn't adequate to do this. Well, he's right. He is inadequate to do God's work. And so are we. God has not given us his work to do because we're adequate to do it. None of us, we're these, vessels of dishonor carrying this great message of honor, and that's not why we've been chosen to do it. God uses people to accomplish his purposes, and the more we're aware of our lack of adequacy, the more we can overcome that, not by making better versions of ourselves, but by trusting in God instead of ourselves. And that awareness of our lack of adequacy should grow over time. It shouldn't diminish. It's like a lot of learning. You start to learn a subject. I don't know if you've noticed this or not. The more you learn about a subject, the more you realize how little you know about it. Well, the more you come to understand the holiness of God, the more you realize how far away you are from it. Our problems aren't solved by making better versions of ourselves. Our problems are solved by getting rid of ourselves altogether and replacing that with Jesus living in us. We're never going to be holy enough or good enough for God's purposes. We're not going to get that way, but we are called, and that is enough. We don't make ourselves adequate. We trust the God who calls us. I think that's a really important thing to get out of this. We could also talk, and we're out of time, but I'll leave this with you to think about, the personal, relational aspect of God, the patience of God, all of these themes that come out of this. I hope this has been at least somewhat helpful to you as we give some thought to this early section of Moses' life. Tomorrow morning we'll come back and we'll start talking about the plagues and how God uses those to deliver his people. Thank you so much for your kind attention today.